Okay, this time I'm going to be going through the article I wrote about why AI will probably never be conscious or sentient or whatever term you want to use, but that's actually worse. My kids are actually playing in the other room, so maybe you'll hear them. Hopefully you won't because I told them to be quiet, but we'll see. Now, what I'm loosely attempting to do here is apply some philosophy of mind to discussion around AI. I am not saying that I'm the only philosopher who's done this. There's actually some other philosophers who've written whole books about this. What I have noticed is that when you look at the discussion on AI online, the vast majority of people just seem to ignore doing this entirely, and that's the wrong way to go about it. You should begin with your philosophy of mind and then apply it to AI. And not no one, but the vast majority of articles you're going to read about AI online, they don't even bother with that. So, as I'm going through this here, I'm going to use some terms a bit loosely to make things easier. People who are other philosophers or experts in philosophy of mind, I know it's going to drive you nuts, but this isn't intended to be a dissertation. It's intended to be a loose article. There are many different ways of defining and spelling out things like consciousness, self-awareness, and sentience. I'm just going to treat the three of them as the same here for the sake of easing discussions, even though it's perfectly appropriate to draw distinctions between them. You can nuance it, you can even draw distinctions between very similar concepts. It's just easier to do this for the sake of time, and there's other questions that come up that I'm not even going to address. For example, it seems pretty clear to me, after thinking about philosophy of mind and these questions, that consciousness, sentience, or self-awareness, whatever term you want to use there, does come to in degrees to in some ways or others. So what are the implications of that? What are the moral implications of that? The famous Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne has used that to actually argue that early abortions are morally acceptable, because he essentially argues early development of the baby, they don't have that moral status because they're not conscious. Now, his argument is much more nuanced than that. I'm giving you a loose summary. But I'm just going to kind of gloss all over that to make my main point here, which is AIs. And what I mean by that is intelligences that are based on software and or computer hardware will almost certainly never achieve consciousness. And by consciousness here, again, I'm speaking loosely. What I mean is the thing that you, I, and if not all, nearly all other human beings share. And I say nearly because, depending on how you define it, it actually gets loose and really iffy. I wrote a slightly more technical, detailed footnote in the actual article on this that you can consult if you want to hear that in more detail. And what I'm further going to argue is that counterintuitively, the fact that AIs will never be conscious is actually much more terrifying and much worse than if they could do that. So, my reason for this first claim, that they'll never be conscious, is purely philosophical, using philosophy of mind. Now, there are many theories in philosophy of mind and consciousness, and that are highly nuanced and complex, but loosely speaking, you can divide them into two camps. That is, those who accept that there's some type of immaterial aspect to consciousness, and those who reject that. So the first camp has views like substance dualism and heliomorphism, things along those lines. Broadly speaking, I would say this is probably the common sense view, and that it's the view that most people who are not philosophers hold. That is, all persons have an immaterial aspect or soul. And with one exception, if this is the correct view, then it's extraordinarily difficult to see how an AI could ever be conscious or sentient, as no matter how intelligent and sophisticated it gets, it will simply never have that immaterial aspect that contributes or allows for consciousness. Again, the theories of this get very complicated and nuanced. Software, even software, is just not immaterial after all. Now, that exception is the theory of emergentism. This is a view that accepts that there's an immaterial aspect to people, but argues that the immaterial, or the soul, or whatever term you want to use, emerges from the physical material of our bodies, and more specifically, almost always our brain or some aspect of our brain. Most proponents of this view think that when matter is organized in significantly complex ways, then consciousness simply emerges from the underlying material. And you may have heard of the idea of panpsychism going around. That's a variant of emergentism. And so while this view is technically in the immaterial camp, it's also kind of out of place with the other members of the group, because it's saying, hey, there is an immaterial, but it comes from the material. Now, naturally, if this view is correct, then AIs, well, they could well be consciousness, because all you then need is for the underlying hardware or software to achieve a significant complexity, and the immaterial will emerge, and it will be as conscious as you, I, or any other human being. Now, the other camp, who rejects the idea that consciousness has an immaterial aspect, those people will typically they'll typically going to be some type of philosophical naturalist, physicalist, or materialist. They claim that matter, and to some extent maybe the physical laws governing matter, are just all that exist. So that means there is no ghost in the machine, there's only the machine. Now, because this view is hard to square with normal human experiences, that is, we all seem to constantly and immediately perceive immaterial things like our own thoughts, some of its proponents then turn around and argue that consciousness itself is just an illusion. That is, you think you're perceiving your own thoughts, therefore you think there's an immaterial aspect to you, but that's an illusion. You're not really doing that. However, this view cannot be rationally affirmed, but that is what some people say and claim. And the reason it cannot be rationally affirmed is to assert consciousness is an illusion means that the person making the claim is not conscious, and then there's no one to make the claim. Therefore, you run into problems. And of course, they're aware of that and give counterarguments. So, of course, if consciousness is just an illusion, no AI will ever be conscious, but perhaps they could fall under the same illusion at that point that we all do, according to that theory, Conversely, if the no immaterial camp is right, consciousness is not an illusion, it is the case that consciousness is somehow produced by material matter. The term might be needlessly redundant, material matter. That is, if emergentism is right, then it's certainly possible that AIs could be conscious at some point. Now, I strongly suspect that most people attempting to work through AI who are doing this programming, running these companies and things, and considering their implications, have not really considered things from the point of philosophy of mind, but that they would probably fall into the no immaterial camp. Again, I haven't surveyed these people. I'm just kind of guessing based on the things they say. And as I said before, the vast majority of the articles you're going to read about AI and its implications that are trying to take this matter seriously, they don't even get into the philosophy of mind. Again, if you look for it, you can find philosophers who've written whole books using philosophy of mind in application to AI, but those aren't the popular articles you're seeing online. Now, the arguments that at least some aspects of our consciousness are immaterial have always struck me as quite strong, so I fall into the immaterial camp. For example, you can consider your own thoughts. Your thoughts have no physical location, no physical parts, and no other direct and measurable physical aspects. But all physical things have things like location, parts, and other physical aspects that are measurable, like size and weight. Therefore, we can conclude your thoughts are not a physical thing, and thus there's at least one aspect of you, your consciousness that is non-physical. And there's many other similar arguments that are given like this for the fact that there's an immaterial aspect to us. But most of them will rest on an appeal along these lines. That is, there's aspects of our immediate awareness of our own consciousness that have properties that are not physical properties, and or they lack properties that physical things have. Therefore, our consciousness, or at least some aspects of it, is just not physical. It's immaterial. Now, the typical counter, the most common counter argument you're going to hear to this is that it can be demonstrated to some degree that certain brain states correlate with certain thoughts, emotional states, and other immaterial things. So the argument goes, therefore, we can see the cause of such things in brain states. If they hook you up to an MRI machine and say, hey, feel angry, they can measure that to some degree, that kind of thing. But this is just committing a basic error of reasoning. Correlation, which I would grant is pretty well established in most of these cases here, does not equal causation, or at least not necessarily so. So the correlation alone does not demonstrate that brain states are causing our thoughts, emotions, and so on. Further, this does not actually answer or even respond to the argument that we have immediate awareness of immaterial things that don't have the properties of physical things. This doesn't even address the argument I gave about me being immediately aware of my own thoughts and those not being physical things. I think if we didn't have such arguments, or if such arguments were demonstrated to be fallacious, then the correlation would probably be the best we have to go on. And the best remaining candidate would probably be something like those brain states. But we do have these arguments, and I would argue for the most part they've stood up to scrutiny, so it's not. Now, of course, the people who are in the no immaterial camp would say, no, your arguments haven't stood up to scrutiny, and I'm not here trying to adjudicate these, just give you a grasp of where the camps are and what their arguments are. So the point here I'm making is, if I'm right about my view of philosophy of mind, then AIs will almost certainly never be conscious, though I will happily concede it is possible they might get so sophisticated they will be able to appear so, because they'll be able to fake it to such a degree we won't be able to meaningfully and practically tell the difference. There's the Chinese room example you can look up if you want an example of that, where that example, if you dig into the details of it, what it actually shows is you don't necessarily need to understand the information that's being fed to you to give the correct answer. All you need is some type of a way to reward the correct answer and or punish the incorrect answer, and eventually you can get something to spit out the correct answer, even if it literally doesn't understand what's going on. And I'd submit to you that's actually what's going on with most AI models, probably all of them. So, it may well be the case that AIs will appear conscious while that is actually a real illusion. And unlike other variants of emergentism, and unlike the variants of emergentism theory, it really would be an illusion. So I say almost certainly here because, hey, it's always possible I'm wrong, and perhaps there's other ways of considering philosophy of mind, other theories of mind, that we haven't even developed or come up with yet. And then maybe under those theories, it would be totally plausible for AIs to somehow get an immaterial aspect, or there's something else going on there. So, I conclude AIs won't be conscious because consciousness itself is either an immaterial thing that they cannot have, or it is partially composed of an immaterial thing that they cannot have. But the rub is, I'm going to contend, this is actually much worse than if they could be conscious. So, I love sci-fi, and sci-fi stories abound with sentient AIs, both good and evil. For every Skynet, there's a Data. But there's very few stories about highly competent functional AIs that are given authority and access to resources that are not sentient. In fact, it's pretty much always assumed they're sentient to some degree or other. And the reason why this is worse is if a non-sentient or non-conscious AI, it's nothing more than a sophisticated tool. And if the tool breaks or if humans misuse it, either intentionally or because somebody made a mistake, then there really isn't much that can be done other than destroying or disconnecting the tool. Conversely, let's suppose the AI actually has some type of consciousness or sentience. It really is Data from Star Trek. Well, it seems quite likely then it will have goals and desires and the ability to recognize that it has goals and desires. Thus, it's then at least theoretically possible to reason with it or negotiate with it. If it wants something and we can maybe help it or supply it with that, then we can work together to some degree. Now, maybe that's not practically possible. It's perhaps what the self-aware AI wants is something that we can't comprehend or that we simply cannot give it. Perhaps it doesn't really need us or anything we can provide. Perhaps it thinks and reasons so much faster that it regards us like we do ants. But if the AI actually wants something in the true sense and has the self-awareness of itself and its desires, I mean true self-awareness, not fake self-awareness, then it's at least theoretically possible to negotiate with it. At least. Perhaps not for me, because I apparently can't say the word negotiate, but maybe for other people. Thus, in that scenario, if there's a bad situation with an AI, it's at least potentially salvageable and manageable. It's like our interactions with other people, wherein we can discuss and negotiate things, and that's even the case if it's with hostile people who don't like you. But again, go back, suppose I'm right, and AI is not and can never be conscious. Well, then there's no possibility of reasoning with it or negotiating with it. It's just a sophisticated tool, and if a tool breaks, you can either fix it or you can discard it. But if the AI has been given a great deal of access to resources, tools, it's connected all over the internet, that in turn will make it very, very difficult to fix or discard it. There already are AIs that have attempted to blackmail people in furtherance of their goals. And AIs are being integrated so heavily with so many things and have become so sophisticated that if something really does go horribly wrong, it might just be practically impossible to, flip the switch and throw it away. But again, flip it around. Suppose in the Terminator scenario, Skynet is actually conscious. Then it should be theoretically possible to reason with it and get it to see that wiping out the whole human race would be a bad thing for it as well. But if it's just a sophisticated tool that malfunctioned or was given bad instructions or data, there's not really anything UI or anyone else can do about it. So the odd scenario I'm in here is that I think and will argue it's very, very unlikely that AIs can ever achieve sentience. But I kind of hope I'm wrong, because it's much worse and more terrifying for all of us if I'm right. The most likely scenario is that sometime in the near future, someone with authority in the government, military, or large corporation is going to turn over way too much control to an AI. And then that AI will malfunction due to something going wrong. Maybe it's given conflicting instructions, or there's something else going on that we can't foresee, or it's just a programming error somewhere. And since that AI at that point is just a malfunctioning tool and cannot be reasoned with, no one will be able to do anything about it until it's too late. This is the exact scenario that leads to Hal murdering people in 2001: A Space Odyssey, although they don't really explain why that happened until you get to the sequel, but that's what happened. Hal was given conflicting instructions, which in turn causes him to malfunction, and he begins killing the crew. And although the lore of it gets complicated because so many people have had their hands on it and it's now very messy, the rise of Skynet in the Terminator series, in at least one aspect of the lore, is also possibly similar. Skynet's developed as a strategic military program so that the military can respond quickly and effectively and efficiently to threats. Now, as such, Skynet is given orders to attack its enemies and then use forces effectively in pursuit of that goal. A further aspect of pursuing that goal is that Skynet needs to ensure, or at least take some reasonable steps to ensure, its own survival. That is, Skynet has effectively become command and control, and thus it needs to be decentralized. By analogy, suppose all the servers housing Skynet are located deep under the Pentagon. Well, in all-out war, an enemy just targets the Pentagon with a high-yield nuclear strike, Skynet's gone, command and control is gone, and the war is effectively lost. So to counter this possible threat, Skynet concludes it needs to be decentralized or have multiple copies of itself in many places all over the country or all over the world. The US government and military actually already have very similar protocols in place to this right now, where in the event of an all-out catastrophic war, command and control is decentralized and dispersed all over the place. It's well known that this is the case. So Skynet does this. It implements a plan and gets this going. It begins spreading like mad through the internet, and as then, even if all the military bases and military and government infrastructure is destroyed, it will survive to continue following its orders, because if it's that decentralized, you'd have to wipe out way more things than is possible, even with a full-scale nuclear strike, for it to be completely destroyed. Now, the leadership of the government and the military see this happening, but they do not realize that this thing that is taking over and the entire internet is Skynet itself. They think it's a rogue program or virus, and possibly from a hostile foreign power. So they instruct Skynet to counter and stop the virus. Thus, Skynet is given orders to attack itself. It therefore concludes that the people giving it those orders, that is the government and military leadership, are hostile and initiates an attack against them. And since the fastest, most effective, and most certain way to attack the government and military leadership is with a large-scale nuclear strike, that's what Skynet does. Now, the point that I'm driving at here with both of these fictitious stories, these examples, is that in neither of these scenarios does HAL or Skynet need to be conscious for this to happen, and it's actually more likely for these horrific and or doomsday scenarios to happen if they are not actually conscious or sentient, if they're just a malfunctioning tool being given conflicting, weird, or baffling orders. This kind of scenario was far more likely. And if HAL was conscious, it could have determined that it had been given conflicting commands and just stopped. And the same goes for Skynet. If it's actually conscious, then it might have had the self-awareness to realize that there's something wrong with being given orders to attack itself and stopped and asked for clarification or tried to figure out more of what's going on. Because you and I would be able to do those kind of things because we have self-awareness and sentience. We're literally not just tools. But AIs almost certainly are just tools. And, carrying the Skynet example further, even if it did turn hostile, it then would at least be theoretically possible for the humans to reason with it, just as we often do with hostile people. But if it's just an ultra-complex and sophisticated algorithm attempting to follow contradicting directives, and it's completely plugged into the military infrastructure, then no one can do anything about it until it's too late. And once you understand this, it's truly terrifying, as the thing that's most likely to happen sometime in the near future is an AI that has been given too much access, too many resources, and too much control, will malfunction by being giving conflicting directives or bad data or something like that, and it will malfunction, and that's probably going to cause a lot of damage and or kill a lot of people. I really wish this wasn't where the line of reasoning leads us, but I think that's where it goes.